Is work a punishment or a blessing? That question is often at the heart of the debate over how to help people get out of poverty. Utah has an answer that other states could learn from.
And what we created in the 1990s with the Utah Department of Workforce Services is one location to access the wide menu of services that the federal government and the state government funds around employment and training, and, as you mentioned, Nick, the supportive services like housing and other things you need to get to work.
We talk with a national expert who actually helped Utah back in the 90s to create a workforce and welfare system that's now the envy of many other states. What can we learn from this to apply to our debates about poverty today? We'll have that and more on this episode of Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we're pleased to be joined this week by Mason Bishop. He's a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the principal of WorkEd Consulting. Mason, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nick.
So I wanted to talk to you because of all the attention that Utah is getting recently around workforce and poverty and upward mobility. I mean, this has kind of been an ongoing story for years. Utah is known and held up as one of the best places, perhaps arguably the best place, when it comes to upward mobility for people trying to get out of poverty. There's data showing that the Salt Lake metro area has some of the highest rates of upward mobility in the nation. There's a lot of factors that go into that. One that we want to talk about today with you is specifically how the state government runs and manages its workforce development programs and its safety net programs. And so I want to start off by asking you kind of big picture. For our listeners who this might sound like, okay, this is a really kind of specific, wonky policy issue. I don't know if I have time to care about that. First, set the stage for us. Why is this issue so important to sort of the American dream and the promise of opportunity in this country? And why should folks actually spend some time caring about it?
Thanks, Nick. So this reminds me of when people ask me, what do I do work-wise? And I always say, well, you know those issues you hear on the news about unemployment, skills, we need worker with the right skills, we don't have enough workers, etc. I work on issues around that. I work a lot with community colleges, with state and local workforce systems like in Utah with the Utah Department of Workforce Services. And the reason this issue is so important is because we really are at a unique time in our economic history in the United States. We've had a convergence of a number of factors. First, we have the baby boomers who probably a number of which were going to retire back in 2008, 9, and 10 timeframe, but with the Great Recession had to delay their retirements. And when COVID came along, they had, I think in many cases, repaired their 401ks and other kinds of things from the Great Recession. And so they've made a decision not to stay in the workforce or re-enter the workforce after the COVID pandemic ended. I think secondly, we've also had a number of families who have made decisions based on what happened during COVID that maybe one parent needs to stay home with the children, for instance, and only one parent return or stay at work. And in addition, we're also facing a convergence of another number of factors of which we're trying to figure out what's causing them. For instance, we have upwards of 7 to 8 million young working age men in the United States who are not in the workforce. We know that we have a lot of people who are not at the skill levels we need, especially for a high technology economy. We're already hearing the discussions around artificial intelligence and automation and the new technologies that are going to be coming at us faster and faster. And how do people adapt to that? What kind of skills are people going to need? How's it going to affect various industries from hospitality to manufacturing to healthcare? So the issue of what is our public and governmental response to these issues becomes increasingly important. And I dare say that I think it's not only an economic question, but it's also a social question as well. We see a lot of social angst in our country over the last 2 decades, starting with the impacts of globalization, moving into now what may be the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence. And for those individuals who do not have the skills, do not have the education, do not have the knowledge that's needed to adapt to these increasing changes, we see their frustrations and we see those play out in various ways. So it's absolutely imperative, in my opinion, that those of us, especially who are on the center right, really look at these issues and see the importance. And I will say, Nick, real quickly, that I do believe that there is an appropriate role for government in addressing these issues. I've had the experience in my career back when I worked, for instance, at the U.S. Department of Labor, when I had to go to various locations and face people who had been unemployed, who had worked at, say, a Whirlpool manufacturing facility for 30 years and had a high school diploma. And they're now in their 50s and 60s, and they came up to me and said, "What do I do now? What do I retrain for? How am I going to get a job that's anywhere near the wages I was making as a high school graduate 30 years into a career?" And when you see those people and have to look them in the face and realize that, yes, there needs to be an appropriate response, that's when myself, as somebody who considers myself more on the center right, I do believe there's a role for government. And it's why I'm so passionate about these issues, because not only is there a role, but for far too long, these programs have not worked efficiently, have not worked to the extent they should. And Utah presents a path forward for how they can work at a more efficient and effective way to address both the economic and social issues we're facing with regard to workers, training, and poverty.
Mason, you're tying into something that I think is really fundamental that's worth highlighting for our listeners, and it's that debates or discussions around public policy programs that focus on workforce development or vocational training or poverty programs, they're not just about those policy issues. This strikes at the heart of the American dream, this idea, this promise of this country, if you will, that if you work hard and do your best, you're going to be able to succeed, to provide for your family, to provide a better life for your kids. And you mentioned the term social angst, and the fact that there might be, surprising to us at times, large numbers of folks who don't feel that way, who don't feel upwardly mobile, at various places throughout the country, and even sometimes folks here in Utah. And I just want to list off those kind of big challenges you mentioned, that men not working at rates they used to, the economics term for our listeners, the labor force participation rate among men being concerningly low, the skills gap, and I saw this in previous work when I worked for the Chamber of Commerce, that there is a serious concern about people not having the skills needed to fill jobs that are open today, and then also just a general workforce shortage and poverty. And that's last one is kind of a big angle that I take on all these issues, is that at the end of the day, whatever policy issues we talk about, America should be a place where your rights are protected and you have the opportunity to succeed through hard work. And if that latter piece doesn't feel real for a lot of folks, that's the importance. That's the thing we want to dive into. I want to ask you, because you mentioned Utah. So you say that Utah is kind of a bright spot on this issue. Walk us through, I guess, first kind of what's the landscape of the debate around these kinds of programs and workforce development systems, and why is Utah so unique?
Well, unfortunately, when you look at federally funded workforce and job training programs, there's not a body of evidence to show that so much of what we spend money on is effective. By that, I mean it may be effective, but we just don't know. And that's a starting place that's kind of a frustration, now that we're 50 or 60 years into these programs. The bigger problem, really, in my opinion, Nick, is that the debate isn't necessarily always around what is most effective like it should be. It's who gets to govern, and how are these programs structured? And so, back in the 1990s, again, when I was in Utah working on workforce and welfare reform issues, often the debate was, work first. You heard that term a lot, making people go to work, time limits on welfare, and those kinds of things. And I would say I always felt like Utah did it right, because as one individual I worked with at the time said to me, Mason, in our welfare reform and our poverty programs in Utah, we don't focus on getting caseloads lower like they do in a lot of other places, because I can get the caseload lower tomorrow by changing my eligibility standards. But here in Utah, we have a phrase called making work pay. And the way you make work pay is that you help people transition to employment. And in the case of in poverty programs, if you're a single parent with children, improving child support options for that individual. So when you look at the work side of that, then the debate really becomes about how best to help people. And I love the term you use, Nick, because that's the core principle I hold and espouse is upward mobility. How do we take people, no matter where they're at economically, and give them the options to be upwardly mobile? To me, the best way to do that is in two sort of ways. One is work experience. It's that opportunity to go to work, learn workplace cultures, learn what people call often the soft skills, or I like to call them employability skills, be able to apply those skills in the workplace, such as adaptability, critical analysis, teamwork, those kinds of skills. And then obviously there is the educational attainment or technical skills attainment that's important as well. And so how do we give people better access to really kind of those two areas, better access to work experience and better access to education and training? Now, I will say that one of my frustrations personally in this debate, and you're seeing this now in current times, is you'll hear the term job quality a lot. And that is a term, frankly, the current administration is using. And I have some problems with that because they have characteristics of job quality, but it assumes that not all jobs are equal. And I understand that we always need to strive to help people become upwardly mobile with jobs that are family self-sufficient, that allow them to save for retirement, that allow access to good health care through health insurance or those kinds of things. But I think, and I dare say that every individual, no matter where you're at some point, just work is important and work ethic is important. And I do feel we've lost some of that. And I think we've lost some of that with some of the public policy debates we have around these programs, that for a lot of people, getting that first job and getting that work experience and then providing maybe some governmental supports if they're not making enough money for family self-sufficiency is appropriate. But to say some jobs aren't good and some jobs are based on a notion of quality, I think is somewhat problematic. So in terms of public policy debate, that's an area where I'm growing increasingly concerned in the discussions we're having, is that instead of talking about upward mobility and how do we meet people where they are and help them improve their situation and provide the supports that make sense for that individual or that family, we talk about some jobs being good and some jobs being bad, and how do we move them toward the better jobs. And I just think it's a little misplaced when we start getting into those debates.
Mason, I want to channel Arthur Brooks, who's a former president of American Enterprise Institute, and of course well known in a number of areas, one of which is the importance of work in a free enterprise system for upward mobility for people. And in that context, he has written and said that too often we sort of implicitly treat work as a punishment. And so either maybe folks on the left will say, well, if you're trying to push work requirements, that's demeaning, that's bad for some reason because you're forcing people, punishing people by making them work a job. And that sometimes even folks on the right can view it as, well, if you're going to get benefits, you better be working. So again, this is kind of it's viewed as a negative. Like you have to work in one of these angles, kind of the argument, whereas we should be saying work is a blessing. And yes, there's a lot of value that comes from earned income from a paycheck, but it's more than just that. In one of our previous episodes, we talked with the leaders of the Alliance for Opportunity, which is a refresher for our listeners, is a coalition of a number of state-based think tanks working on these various issues: workforce policy, poverty, and welfare reform, and upward mobility. And one of the points they made that I thought was quite compelling is that there's actually a lot of intrinsic benefit to the individual and to a family that comes from work that cannot be measured just by the paycheck. So do you think we need to shift our lens and maybe say, look, this is a core common sense principle that we need to restore as a national norm, that work in many forms is important and a blessing and is part of your trajectory of true upward mobility? Is that a fair way to put it?
It is. And I would say that I think we've lost something in the last 20 years where, again, I'm a Gen Xer. I'll blame my generation a little bit for this as well as the baby boomers. But I think, I always joke with my friends that we were I feel like we were the grinded out generation. We grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it was about putting your nose to the grindstone and go and go and go. And you worked hard and you put yourself through college and other kinds of things. And I think somewhere along the way, with good intentions, many of us as parents didn't want our kids to have to grind it out quite so hard. In some ways, we've created a culture of comfort in the United States a little bit, to where we try to eliminate challenges. We try to eliminate the need to overcome and to persevere. And I think we as human beings, I think it's actually in our DNA to take challenges head on. And I think we're at our best when we overcome sometimes tough times, each as individuals and as communities, frankly. And there's many, many examples of that. Again, I think that when it comes to work, and I saw, again, during the 1990s when I was involved in welfare reform, and we would go and meet individuals who were primarily single parents, who were given the opportunity to work because of the Department of Workforce Services and the way we set those programs up and the philosophy we had behind those programs. And I can't tell you, Nick, person after person after person, very emotional feelings behind it, would talk about how their children are proud of them because mom is going to work. And I look at work, and I think this is what I've talked to my own children about, is find your passion. Yes, we all have had to do jobs where we think, oh my goodness, I hated doing that. My mom drove me down when I was 16-year-old and living in Arizona to the local Burger King on a Saturday and I said, Mom, why are we here? And she goes, because you're going in there to apply for a job. And I was playing summer baseball, American Legion, and having fun, right? But at the same time, closing that restaurant, being all greasy at night and all of that was some of the best things I did, because it taught me that value of work, and it taught me the value of what it's like to earn money, to pay taxes, frankly, to understand what money is and what it isn't, and all of that. And so depending on where you are in your life, absolutely, I am a big believer that people finding their passions through work is very important. And it is more than just a paycheck. It is, for many of us, it's about who we are and how we characterize ourselves and what it is that we like to do. I do consulting, I do writing. I love it because for me, consulting is not only a job. I tell people all the time that one of the best things about it is I've made friends all across the United States that I never would have anticipated making. So it's a core part of who I am now. So yes, in short, to answer your question, I think we're losing a little bit of the understanding of work as a passion, of work as an innate part of who we are, and the importance of it that we as human beings need to have to feel like we're achieving something on a daily basis, monthly and annual basis.
Mitch, we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to get into the policy specifics. I think you've done a great job sort of outlining this principled approach to the benefit of work, but I want to ask you about some of the details of Utah's kind of unified workforce model compared to other states, and what some of the coming debates will be on the national level about other states that might be interested in doing that same thing. So we'll get into all that when we come back. This is Defending Ideas with AEI's Mason Bishop. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn. We've been talking with Mason Bishop. He's a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a principal for Work Ed Consulting, talking about workforce development programs, but really poverty and opportunity and upward mobility for all Americans. And before we continue with the conversation, I want to mention if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. There you can access short clips from this episode, as well as previous episodes and full episode links that you can share on social media. We encourage you to do so to help inform your discussions about these issues with family and friends. That's defendingideas.org. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, all the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your podcasts, just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. Mason, I want to kind of get into some of the specifics about why Utah's different from other states and how that can be informative and hopefully a little bit aspirational for other states and what policy looks like elsewhere, because we always want to export good ideas and also learn from others and see what we can still improve here in Utah. And I want to mention, just by way of helping to frame, I think, what the general feeling is here in Utah. Our listeners may not know, but I previously worked for the Department of Workforce Services here in Utah a number of years back. And an experience I had really shaped my own view of poverty and upward mobility. In the course of that work, I interacted with a man here in Salt Lake who was formerly homeless, who was living in a supportive housing program that was part of the general homelessness work that Workforce Services was doing. And in this interaction, I asked him once, hey, what do you feel like you need? What do you think would be helpful for you or other people who've been in your same shoes dealing with this? What would be helpful for you? And to be honest, I thought he was going to say something like, well, the safety net programs just need to be more generous, so they need to have more resources going to homeless shelters or something like that. Instead, what he said to me was, I just want a hand up, not a hand out. And I was blown away because I didn't coach him or anything, but it was just this idea of I'm here to work. And he had actually moved to Utah seeking work opportunities. And then things didn't turn out well initially for his circumstance, but just this idea of I'm here to work and I want help to get back on my feet so I can work and earn my own success. It totally impacted the way I view these things ever since then. And I think overall, we still, of course, have room for improvement. But overall, that's kind of been Utah's approach, is our safety net programs are here to help people, yes, but then help them get back on their feet, help them move towards self-sufficiency. It's about stabilizing and then moving towards work. So that's kind of the ethos that I've always felt. But I want to ask you, because you were one of the architects in the 90s of Utah creating this system, and you've seen how things work in other states. Give us just kind of the quick definition. Why is Utah so different from other states? What does our workforce and welfare system look like? And why is other states being in a different approach problematic in those areas?
So I'll try to take a complicated history and narrow it down into just a few minutes. Number one is we have about, since the 1960s, 5 to 6 decade history of layering one on top of the other different workforce and social assistance programs, starting with the Great Society. And in the workforce development side of this, really started in the 1960s, but then an important thing happened in the 1970s with what was called the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, or CETA for short, where the federal government established a federal to local relationship in funding job training. That legacy exists to this day, and it, in some ways, is fundamental to part of the challenge we face. Because for the most part, the other federal employment and social assistance programs come to states, and the governors and the state legislatures determine how those services are delivered. So if you might imagine, let's say 15 or 16 different programs coming from the U.S. Department of Labor, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, in the billions of dollars and in millions in the case of each individual state, coming to those states in these different siloed pots of money, and then saying to the state, okay, you now need to take this and figure out how these are delivered to people. And oh, by the way, we're going to create a lot of rules around each one as to how you deliver it. Then what happens is states are essentially handcuffed. And so what I like to say, the difference essentially between Utah and most places is that in Utah, I can go to any community, and what we created in the 1990s with the Utah Department of Workforce Services is one location to access the wide menu of services that the federal government and the state government funds around employment and training. And as you mentioned, Nick, the supportive services like housing and other things you need to get to work. Whereas if I go to almost any other community in any other state, I have to go to 3 or 4 locations because those siloed programs are delivered through siloed services at the state and local level.
So Mason, essentially, to put it in terms for sort of a normal person on the street, if they find themselves down on their luck and they need help, in other states, as I understand it, and correct me where I'm wrong here, in other states, I would go to a government entity for, say, food stamps or cash assistance or kind of whatever just the temporary stabilizing program is. And I would go there and they would give me, help to stabilize my situation. But then if I also wanted help, upskilling or finding a job, I just say, hey, I lost my job. I need some help for a few months until I can get back on my feet, but I want to find a new job. I have to go to a completely different government agency in other states to be able to get that workforce training or workforce connection. Whereas here in Utah, it's all the same. I go to one entity, Department of Workforce Services. If I'm eligible for safety net programs, they will help me get plugged into those so I can stabilize the situation for my family. But then also as part of that, they say, okay, let's also get you on your job search efforts or upskilling. There's a number of programs they connect folks with. Is that the correct summation? And if so, explain to our folks why that's so impactful, why having one place to go makes a huge difference for people trying to get out of poverty or just trying to get back on their feet.
Yeah, well, the first thing I always try to think about, Nick, is people who are in those kinds of situations in the first place. People who are laid off due to government shutdowns during COVID. People who grew up in a home or a community where educational attainment was not something that was just naturally occurred, that maybe I grew up in a community where a high school diploma was enough to have a decent job, and now all of a sudden it's not. Or maybe I found myself in a dysfunctional situation with a relationship that left me on my own with a couple of children. In all those kinds of cases, people are at some of their most vulnerable times in their lives. And what we make them do is navigate a maze of office locations, websites, applications, case managers at some of the most vulnerable times of our lives. It actually sometimes makes me angry when I think about it, to be honest with you, because it's just not the way it's supposed to be. I'm proud to say of the work we did in Utah and the work that has continued from individuals all the way to now, where Casey Cameron, the Executive Director of Workforce Services, and her staff, where they have created an environment where people who are at their most vulnerable time get access to the full array of federally and state-funded services they might be eligible for. And that sounds like, yeah, that should be a no-brainer, but unfortunately, it's not the way it works in most places. And frankly, it's not the way federal policy, starting with some of the legislation that Congress passes, allows states to do. So in many cases, for instance, the Utah model, as we like to call it, isn't even allowed under current federal law. And I know that gets bureaucratic and there's a lot of details to that. But for your listeners to know, the main point is our federal legislative infrastructure is so broken right now that one of the best models that many other states want to aspire to isn't even allowed under current federal law. And that really is as a result of protecting interest groups and other kind of legacy situations that have occurred over the 50 or 60 years versus what's best for people. So I always try to stay focused on that vulnerable person and how do we help them with the situation they're trying to navigate in a seamless and friendly, customer-friendly and caring way. And caring isn't making people go to 3 or 4 different locations and navigating 3 or 4 different case management systems. It's places like Utah, where I can go and I can meet a person or meet a team of people who can get me where I need to be in terms of services.
Mason, you mentioned earlier when we were talking offline in preparation for this that there's been sort of additional focus on Utah and the Utah model since the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wonder, in the minutes we have left, if you can talk about what has sort of caused, because this has been the circumstance for years, for decades, where Utah is unique. Other states kind of have this patchwork system that's not helpful for folks getting out of poverty, as you've said. So there's a lot worthy of emulation from the Utah model in other states, but it's been that way for a long time. So what about the COVID-19 pandemic sort of prompted a fresh look, and for leaders maybe around the country to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's time for us to take a hard look at our workforce programs, and what does that mean with what's next? What are the efforts going on to try and change this in a positive way for other states?
Well, probably, Nick, was about a year or two ago, I started getting calls from different states. I have talked to Georgia, Texas, I've been to Baton Rouge, Louisiana twice this year. Here in Virginia, where I live now, I'm doing work in West Virginia. In all these different cases, they called up and they said, what's going on in Utah? We're trying to understand. And often what they ask me is one part of Utah. They'll say, hey, we know and your listeners won't know what this term means, but we know you're a single state area. What that means, essentially, I mentioned that federal-local relationship. Well, that federal-local relationship in Utah doesn't necessarily exist because Utah is considered a single state area. So therefore, its job training dollars can serve the entire state versus a regional workforce area, which almost all other states have to do under federal law. And so they'll call me up, and I think the best story to tell is one governor's staff who said, we want to be best in class. That was the term they used, Nick, was best in class. And so we created these factors. I don't know what the factors were exactly, but they said we looked at all the states, and based on what we came up with as our definition of best in class, Utah performed either first or second on every one of our indicators. So what did you guys do there exactly? I will tell you too, the other big thing that I think has caught people's attention is that because these programs are all housed in a single agency and administered that way, DWS is a lot more nimble. And I think the current staff would tell you that that's one of the great strengths of the DWS model is the agility and nimbleness. So for instance, all of a sudden when your unemployment insurance applications are going through the roof because of COVID shutdowns, DWS is able to cross-train different staff to all of a sudden, in a short-term basis, take unemployment insurance claims and help with that because they're all housed in the same administrative roof. Versus other states where your UI program is separate from your TANF or welfare program, and it might be separate from your job training system. And so therefore, you get this barrage of people applying for unemployment insurance, and you're scrambling for how do I hire temporary workers, or how do I deal with pay overtime, or figure out do I have enough people to take claims. And so that nimbleness is critical, and that efficiency in place where customers can all go to get the services they need is very important. So in other words, Utah DWS can react appropriately to the situations, especially with COVID, and then coming out of COVID when they were able to put all the resources to bear to get people reemployed, to meet the skill needs that were there coming out of COVID, to help people with transitioning from one industry to another, one job to another. Utah had that all in one place and was able to do so much more effectively than most other states.
Mason, I'll mention for our listeners, you wrote a paper for AEI called The Utah Model that basically goes through this in depth. We'll include the link to that in the show notes for anyone who's interested, that goes through each of these areas and why this unified workforce model, I want to stress this for the folks out there, it's not just a really wonky bureaucratic policy thing. This is a better approach to helping people who are trying to get out of poverty, get back on their feet. We're going to help you, and we're going to help you help yourself through work or training or those kinds of things. And frankly, the fact that this isn't sort of the norm in other states is in some ways kind of baffling to me. And so in just the minute or two that we have left, what's next? How do we fix this? What do you think ought to happen on the national level? What's the best first step, and what are some of the efforts going on to help move that forward so other states can benefit from this kind of work-centered approach that Utah has?
So I should say, too, in addition to the workers, we also have employers who aren't getting the skilled workers they need to expand their businesses and be productive. So it really is on both the demand and supply side of labor that we should be concerned about this issue. But essentially, there really is a movement that's starting to occur where members of Congress and others are starting to hear more about we need to make some changes to our federal laws. Congressman Burgess Owens has introduced legislation to allow states to request demonstration and waivers from the federal government in order to experiment and try things. Because I would be the last person to say Utah model needs to be exactly what every other state does, because we're in a federalist system where one of the strengths of our governmental system is that states are different, their populations are different, and we can try different things. So one of the big things we're trying to do at the federal level is allow for state innovation, state experimentation, and to be able to do some things and try some things to bring it closer to what Utah has been able to achieve.
I think that's a great note to end on. It's this core principle that we talk about often, but there's a good example of it, of let's let states actually be laboratories of democracy where they can be innovative and try these policy ideas. So Mason, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Defending Ideas and sharing your expertise, and for all the work you do that makes a difference for the lives of people trying to get out of poverty, provide for their families. It's impactful. And again, as we said at the beginning, at the core of the American dream. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to continue the discussion around workforce and poverty and upward mobility. Right after this, you're listening to Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we're talking on this episode about workforce programs and poverty and upward mobility. And we're going to continue the conversation on those programs and what things actually look like here in Utah. And we're joined now by Nate McDonald, who's the former Deputy Director for the Utah Department of Workforce Services. Nate, thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Happy to be here.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you is we got a good overview from Mason Bishop about kind of the historical lens, what happened in the 90s here in Utah, and sort of a general look at the workforce system here in Utah compared to other states. And I want to start by asking you to kind of give us what did it look like from the practitioner's point of view, from the folks actually doing this today on the ground here in Utah. We've heard the term the Utah model. Maybe a more accurate way to describe it is the single state kind of model, or this DWS model that we have here. First, can you give us just a quick overview? What is the model that happens here in Utah, and why do you view it as, in general, something that's been helpful for helping Utahns get and stay out of poverty?
Yeah, well, I think it really comes back to the vision that was in place by Olene Walker, our lieutenant governor back in the 90s, serving under Governor Michael Leavitt. And they had this vision of a model of really bringing together, the workforce programs with the public assistance programs. And when you think about how it was set up back then and how it's set up in other states really you had 29 different programs dispersed between 5 different state agencies. And essentially when you look at all that, you know, the word we used when we referred to the lieutenant governor, I read about this, is she said, there's just got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to do it. And so that kicked off in the mid 90s, really investigating, looking at, there was a whole task force that brought it together to analyze how can we, what is that better way? And essentially that's how the Department of Workforce Services got created. It brought those programs all together. So where now you have, for example, you have the eligibility for our public assistance programs, SNAP, Medicaid, child care, general assistance programs. That eligibility process is done within the Department of Workforce Services. Where do you go online to find that information? jobs.utah.gov. Right beside that is all of our Department of Labor workforce programs to be able to help people find jobs, find employment, build out their resumes, get the supportive services, the training that they need to be able to help them get that next job, better job. Right beside that is our unemployment insurance division, where people, when they do lose their job, no fault to their own, they apply for unemployment insurance, and they're able to build to quickly connect back to the services, the tools, the resources with our Department of Labor programs, for workforce development. And so essentially this model is just to help better connect those dots. When they're housed under one agency, those dots are able to be connected, recognizing that from a federal standpoint, they're all set up in different federal agencies, different federal departments or funding streams. But having them housed at the local level with one state agency helps better connect the dots to those programs, and from an administrative standpoint, it makes it easier.
One of the things I think is worth pinpointing is, one of the things we talked about with Mason earlier in this episode is some additional attention to what's happening in Utah, and just in general, attention to workforce programs and how do we help people when there are big economic shocks. And the example for that was the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had on the workforce. And so I want to ask you whether it's that or something else, whatever context can help convey to our listeners, what are some examples of how you would describe as successes of the DWS model here in Utah that you think, look, we've been able to be effective at doing this, in part at least because of this structure that we have. It's beneficial where we're well equipped to be nimble and respond to crises, to maybe be more efficient in connecting people to what they need. What are maybe just one or two key points of, we've actually done this pretty well here in Utah, and we're glad that our structure allows us to do that? Anything that comes to mind like that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is pretty much what I mentioned before, is you're just able to connect the dots much easier. When you look at the pandemic and everything that happened during the pandemic, from just a huge shock to the system with unemployment and things that happened as a result of the pandemic, but there weren't jobs. So that, initially, because people were pulling back. But then things quickly changed. And that connection to the workforce programs just opened that door, and we're able to more quickly mobilize and help people and assist them. But I would say the biggest thing that kind of comes to mind outside of the pandemic and everything like that is Utah's been able to build its system primarily being self-service. And that is a big key. We're not private industries gaining revenue off of our labor exchange tool, right? So as much as we can do and help people get the services they need online and from a self-service standpoint, just allows us to build. It's better for them as the customer, but then it also frees up our resources to help those who do need more individualized attention. And so we're able, that's where we are. We connect everything to our online services through jobs.utah.gov. And in there you have all the different, if you're a job seeker, you have the job seeker portal. If you're needing temporary assistance, you have the temporary assistance portal. If you need, and then we connect all the dots with our data and everything like that. So, and then our business supports, how we support businesses. And so, but as much as we can drive and have people do things online, and because we're in this single state model where we have all these services and programs, we're just able to connect those dots much easier.
In the minute or two we have left, I want to mention that one of the things we talked about with Mason as well is in general, it's always nice to be able to say, hey, Utah's good at this thing. And encourage, hey, whenever there are good ideas at the state level, this idea of the laboratories of democracies, can states learn from one another? And one of the things I want to ask you is, knowing that no government system is perfect, there's always room for continuous improvement. What do you think is important for our listeners to take away from the conversation as far as what seems to work well here in Utah, as people are having conversations about what workforce programs could look like in other states or at the federal level? What are some key takeaways you think we need to remember to both recognize that, yeah, we can be aspirational about this idea of work and welfare can go together? And I think they've done that well here in Utah, knowing we can always still improve things. But what do our listeners need to remember as these kinds of discussions are happening in other states and at the federal level?
Well, I think it's not anything we're going to stand up on the hillside and say, oh, do it like us here in Utah, because we also recognize that every state is different. We recognize that we're a medium-sized state, getting bigger, growing, obviously, but what works for us isn't going to work for a small state. What works for us isn't going to work for a large state. What we have found is working for us. But we still have challenges. We still have to work with our federal partners. We still have to connect those dots. We still have to be able to, as much as we want to say it's a one-door approach, there's still challenges where you're dealing with different federal aspects of it, and you have to be able to still manage those things. And so it's still complicated. It's not perfect, but we're able to make it work here in Utah. And so, it's just important to recognize that not every state is the same, and they're going to have their challenges, and they're going to have to be able to figure out. They need to be able to figure out what works for them under however Congress allows them to do it.
The last thing I'll mention as we wrap up is that the thing I love about this discussion overall, and again, for our listeners, I mentioned with Mason, that sometimes this stuff can maybe sound a little bit wonky or, governmental policy. Do I really need to focus on that? But that underlying principle of there's something fundamental about the American dream, this promise of America that if you work hard, you can have an opportunity to provide a better life for yourself and your kids. And I think that's one of the things that I like about, again, the nature of this dialogue is it's all about how do we help people in a better way? What are we doing in Utah that works well? Where can we improve? What is happening in other states, and where can maybe they have opportunities to try things that work for them in search of improvement? So I guess I just want to use that as kind of a bookend principle to thank you for everything that you've done and what happens in Utah, but also the spirit of continuous improvement, because our friends and neighbors, our fellow Utahns, our fellow Americans who desperately want to work and provide a better life for themselves and their kids, that seems to be the animating principle of so much of what this discussion is about. So again, I want to thank you for participating and helping elevate this, because these are the kind of conversations that I think can reduce some of the polarization around these issues and help us, again, focus on how do we help the American dream feel more attainable for more Utahns and more Americans.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Nate, once again from Department of Workforce Services. That is all for our guests. We're going to have one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. As we finish up, there's one thing I think we all need to remember whenever we're discussing how to address poverty. There is no true path out of poverty that isn't anchored to sustained work. We hear all the time about proposals to simply give money to people, sometimes called universal basic income, as the solution to poverty. Well, let me ask you a question. If you had a friend or relative come to you and say, hey, I'm down on my luck, I'm stuck in poverty, I need some help, and you gave them cash or a place to stay indefinitely, would you pat yourself on the back and say, this person's no longer poor thanks to me? No, you would recognize that helping them stabilize is a good and noble thing to do, and you would help them find work or acquire skills to move back towards self-reliance. Nowhere is this principle better demonstrated than the story of the homeless man that I met, who, when I asked him what he needed from the government, simply said he wanted a hand up, not a hand out. Fortunately, work is central to Utah's approach to helping people escape poverty. That doesn't mean that everything that happens in Utah is perfect. There's always plenty of room for improvement. But the fact that Utah's approach combines temporary help with a long-term investment in someone's value as a contributor to society speaks volumes, and it works. Utah is consistently recognized as the national leader in opportunity. We have really low unemployment, ample job opportunities, and a new social mobility index from the Archbridge Institute ranks Utah as the #1 state in the nation for upward mobility. There's a lot of good that's happening in Utah that should inform approaches elsewhere. But at the very least, states should have more freedom to try different approaches the way that Utah did. Because who knows what we could learn from another innovative, enterprising state about the best way to help people escape poverty, if the freedom to try is expanded. Well, we hope you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you like this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find more shows and also clips that you can use in your conversations. We encourage you to share these clips with friends and family or in your social media channels as you're discussing these issues. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you like to get your shows. Just type in Defending Ideas in the search bar and click subscribe. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Well, that's all for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.